Chapter 6. The Emotional Economy of Exile. Every civilization is built on invisible economies, not just of money or power but of emotion. Trust, empathy, reciprocity, and belonging are the currencies that keep societies stable. When those currencies collapse, everything else follows: markets, morals, and minds. This is the emotional economy of exile, the hidden exchange rate between private neglect and public decay. Exile without distance. Exile doesn't always mean leaving home. Sometimes it means living inside a home where your presence no longer counts as membership. You eat at the same table, breathe the same air, but your contributions don't register, your needs go unbudgeted. That's what I call internal exile, being present but emotionally deported. When this happens in a family, the individual atrophies. When it happens across thousands of families, a society does. Because the skills we learn in our private relationships, listening, empathy, repair, are the same skills that sustain justice, fairness, and accountability in public life. If those skills die in the home, they die in the culture. The emotional supply chain. Think of empathy as a raw material, mined early in life through safe relationships, processed through education, and distributed through institutions. When supply runs low, everything built from it begins to crumble. Families are the factories where empathy is manufactured. Schools are the shipping routes that distribute it through cooperation and teamwork. Communities are the retail spaces where empathy gets exchanged for trust and belonging. Governments are the regulators meant to ensure fair distribution. But when families discriminate emotionally, when certain members are marginalized, silenced, or shamed, the entire supply chain weakens. Children grow up emotionally undernourished. Schools inherit fear instead of curiosity. Workplaces reward performance over compassion. Governments mirror the coldness of their citizens. The result is not random chaos, it's systemic emotional bankruptcy. How exile becomes economy. A person raised in emotional scarcity learns to survive on deficit. They internalize that resources, love, attention, safety, are limited, and someone else must lose for them to win. That's how the poverty mindset begins, long before money enters the picture. In the emotional economy of exile, scarcity isn't financial, it's psychological. People hoard validation the way others hoard wealth. They exploit vulnerability the way corporations exploit labor. They manipulate loyalty the way regimes manipulate faith. It's all the same structure, learned early, repeated often. Poverty, crime, and corruption are not simply moral failings, they are symptoms of relational economies that teach deprivation as truth. The neuroeconomics of disconnection. Modern neuroscience gives us a window into why this happens. When people live in chronic social exclusion, the brain's reward system rewires. Acts of cooperation or altruism no longer trigger the same dopamine responses. The amygdala, the brain's threat detector, dominates decision-making. This means that fear, not fairness, drives behavior. In contrast, societies with high social cohesion show stronger activation in the brain's empathy and reward networks during cooperative tasks. In other words, belonging literally changes what feels good. This explains why some environments naturally foster generosity and innovation while others breed corruption and cynicism. They operate on different neurochemical economies. One runs on trust, the other runs on threat. Crime is a cry for connection. Every criminologist knows that crime is often rooted in disconnection. People who feel invisible seek intensity, even destructive forms of it, just to feel alive. Theft, violence, addiction, exploitation, these are distorted attempts at stimulation in a starved nervous system. When someone says, "I didn't care," what they really mean is, "I couldn't feel." That's not an excuse, it's an explanation. In a brain atrophied by neglect, empathy circuits lie dormant. Risk feels like relief. Chaos feels like proof of existence. We punish behavior but ignore its biology. We build prisons when we should be building belonging. Poverty as inherited disconnection. Material poverty and emotional poverty are twins, born from the same neglect. A child raised without emotional security learns that the world is unreliable. That worldview becomes a psychological template: don't invest, don't trust, don't expect fairness. In adulthood, this translates into reduced risk-taking, low financial literacy, and self-protective pessimism. Economic behavior mirrors emotional conditioning. That's why interventions that only provide money often fail, unless they also rebuild confidence, connection, and self-worth. People can't plan for futures they don't believe they deserve. When policy ignores psychology, poverty persists. Corruption as institutionalized atrophy. Corruption is what happens when emotional scarcity reaches the top of the hierarchy. It is the moral form of hoarding. Those in power accumulate safety, status, or wealth at others' expense, not because they're evil, but because they've been trained to see trust as risk and empathy as weakness. The same logic that allows a parent to gaslight a child allows a politician to lie to a nation. Both are acts of control disguised as care. Both stem from the same deficit, a fear of accountability. Corruption, then, is not the opposite of morality, it's the extension of emotional neglect into policy. It's psychological atrophy with a title and a pension. When belonging becomes a luxury. In emotionally impoverished societies, belonging becomes a privilege instead of a birthright. People compete for inclusion the way they once competed for food. Social media, consumerism, and identity politics all feed this hunger. Offering connection without intimacy, validation without accountability. It's a survival adaptation in a world that has forgotten how to nurture. We're starving for something that can't be bought. The mathematics of empathy. If economists tracked empathy the way they track GDP, they would find an inverse correlation between inequality and compassion. When the gap between the safe and the unsafe widens, empathy collapses. The wealthy insulate themselves, the poor harden themselves, the middle disassociates. This is how domestic discrimination scales into global imbalance. Families teach selective compassion, and nations replicate it in policy. The result is a humanity divided into castes of perceived worth. What began as a quiet exclusion in one home becomes an algorithm that governs billions. Repairing the emotional economy. Repair begins where the collapse began, in relationship. Empathy, like currency, must circulate to retain value. We restore economies of care the same way we restore physical economies, by reinvesting in the neglected. Here's how that looks in practice. Micro-level, families and friendships practice open dialogue, repair after conflict, and unconditional regard. Meso-level, schools and workplaces reward collaboration over competition, emotional literacy over performance. Macro-level, governments measure well-being alongside productivity, funding programs that build social cohesion and trust. In all three levels, the principle is the same: belonging is infrastructure. You can't build sustainable systems on emotional debt. A moment of reflection. During one of my recovery meetings, Amun once said, "I didn't start stealing because I wanted things. I started because I wanted to matter." That line stayed with me. It captured the whole emotional economy of exile in a single sentence. When people can't matter through love, they'll matter through disruption. When empathy fails, adrenaline replaces it. And that's how emotional bankruptcy becomes social instability. From exile to citizenship. The opposite of exile isn't return, it's participation. To reverse psychological atrophy, people need places to contribute, not just places to heal. Communities that welcome wounded people back into purpose as mentors, artists, volunteers are not just compassionate, they're strategic. Every recovered empath is a restored citizen. Every healed family is a small government learning how to be honest again. That's the real antidote to crime and corruption, the recreation of belonging. Closing reflection. Poverty, crime, and corruption are not random misfortunes. They are predictable outcomes of emotional economies built on exclusion. When love is rationed, fairness vanishes. When connection is conditional, conscience collapses. We cannot legislate morality without legislating belonging. We cannot heal nations without healing homes. Because the future of civilization will not be decided by markets or militaries, but by whether we remember that the human heart, like any currency, loses value when it stops being shared. End of Chapter 6, The Emotional Economy of Exile. Chapter 7. Psychological Malnutrition.